Clare. The question is that this bill be now read a second time. Leave the call to the member for Hotham.
Speaker, we've seen a lot of rough and tumble in this House in the last 24 hours, a lot of politicking and personalities coming to the fore of the political discussion. But I rise today to make a contribution on a matter before this House which is deadly serious, Speaker. The bill before us is something that raises incredibly complex questions. And watching the discussion back in my office, what I actually see is a lot of people in this parliament who are trying to make a good contribution, a real contribution that grapples with some tremendously difficult ethical, legal, practical questions, and specifically in relation to the situation we see of alcohol and gambling abuse in remote and rural communities around this country, and in particular that problem in how it affects Indigenous Australians. Speaker, the Social Security Legislation Amendment Debit Card Trial Bill 2015 would institute a system that would essentially limit the amount of income that people who live in specific communities around Australia can spend on alcohol and gambling. The first community would be Ceduna in South Australia, and if the legislation passes the parliament, that trial would begin next year and last for an additional year. Speaker, the genesis of this idea comes really from the report that was commissioned by the Abbott government, which requested that Andrew Forrest, who many would know as a business leader in Australia, to conduct a review into employment, specifically in its relation to Indigenous Australians. I'm not sure of this person's expertise in Indigenous policy generally, but he's got some runs on the board in terms of employment, and he did produce a report that had a lot of ideas and incredibly wide-ranging in scope. And one of them, Deputy Speaker, has been picked up in the bill before us. So essentially, the scheme that the government is proposing would see people who are living in these specific communities who are on working age payments, so we're thinking there about things like New Start, disability support or carer pensions, and they'd be issued with a debit card that couldn't be used to purchase alcohol and gambling products. So what the bill proposes is that 80% of regular payments for people who are on regular payments and 100% of lump sum payments would be put into this specific card that limited the use of the money. So I want to just make it really plain to those listening how significant this is, what's being proposed in this bill. What the government is proposing is that people, just by virtue of living in this specific town, will have their income, their right to spend their income as they choose, curtailed in some way, and that those rules wouldn't be applied to other Australians. And so I think, Deputy Speaker, it's absolutely incumbent on us to be upfront about what a morass of ethical issues are raised by the legislation before us. Just basic questions like on what basis government can decide that one community is different to another. Deputy Speaker, I believe that social security is the right of Australians living in a prosperous country as they do, but what type of principles should we be applying to the idea that government can put conditions on the payments that people receive? And I think, Deputy Speaker, right to the heart of the complexity of this issue is what are the long-term impacts of policies which essentially take away people's choice. And we know that a lot of the issues of Indigenous disadvantage that we see around Australia lie at their very heart in a place of powerlessness. So we need to really consider very carefully type of policies that may reinforce these ideas. Deputy Speaker, Labor is not going to reject this bill on the basis of the issues that I have outlined, and there are some very, very good reasons to that, which I'll explain. But what we would like to do, Deputy Speaker, is have a Senate inquiry into the bill. I think that's key because there are some real missing pieces to the argument that's being put forward by the coalition here. So one specific and very obvious issue with the legislation before the House is that it attempts to manage alcohol and gambling, which are addictive diseases, by taking away people's income or their right to use their income for these reasons, but it has made no specific guarantees about service provision to help people come off those addictions, Deputy Speaker. Coming off an alcohol addiction is not something that can just be managed by an ordinary family, and it would be incredibly unfair for us to put in place a scheme that will try to have that impact without putting in place additional supports around the people who will be most affected. People need services to kick these habits, and Labor wants to understand what the specifics are in terms of what will be provided to these communities. Deputy Speaker, there are a lot of other issues that I think we need to have first-hand, on the record representations from the affected communities put into the public realm and to the interests of this parliament. Because, as I say, some of the things that this bill proposes, frankly, are pretty radical. One of the specifics of this scheme and in how it mainly differs from the income management approach that Labor used in government, Deputy Speaker, is that this scheme is not put in place by triggers. So the Labor scheme had a series of indicators that you had to reach before you went into an income management scheme. Deputy Speaker, the entire town of Ceduna will be placed under income management. Everyone who receives a government payment of the types that I described will be captured. Of course, Deputy Speaker, we need to provide the people who will be affected an appropriate formal opportunity to put their view. I know that the Minister responsible for this area has visited the communities, and I applaud him for that. I know he's spent time talking to community leaders, but I don't think that's good enough, Deputy Speaker. We need to hear more, and it needs to be on the public record. Deputy Speaker, the other point that I would just make is that the bill, in its name, in every aspect, is a trial. It's going to last for a year in Ceduna. But one of the other really critical missing pieces of the puzzle here is how this trial is going to be evaluated. And Deputy Speaker, of course, you and I both know that there are different techniques you can use to evaluate trials, and depending on what outcome you want to see, you can design a process around that. That's not what we want to see. This is a serious policy proposal, and we want to understand exactly how it's going to be evaluated and how that process will fall out as the trial continues. But, Speaker, I do say that there are significant reasons for us to consider the merits in this bill. And I want to talk about some of the reasons why I think we do need to look at what would be otherwise really untenable policies because of the severity of the situation that we're dealing with in some of these communities. Now, I haven't visited Ceduna, so I can't profess at all to be well acquainted with the issues facing that community, but I have lived in a community that faces similar issues, Deputy Speaker. A few years ago, I spent 9 months living in northeast Arnhem Land in a small town that sits about halfway between Cairns and Darwin. This is one of the most unbelievably beautiful parts of the country, Deputy Speaker. The beautiful top end, it was really paradise in terms of the physical environment. And this is a place that is surrounded by incredible Indigenous communities that are living quite in concert with the way that their ancestors have lived for thousands and thousands of years in Australia. These are people that communicate with one another in their Indigenous languages. For many, Deputy Speaker, English is their 5th or 6th language, something I think is not known to nearly enough Australians. Deputy Speaker, it is a beautiful place, the top end, but there are communities who are experiencing this incredible blight of violence. I think it is absolutely at crisis proportions in many communities around the country, and it's real and it's vicious and it's frankly unimaginable to anyone who hasn't seen it up close. Deputy Speaker, while I lived in that part of Australia, my partner, who was working as a doctor at the time, worked in the hospital that services all of the acute medical needs of the surrounding communities. And Deputy Speaker, it was honestly a very difficult personal experience to see someone just day in, day out come home having to manage incredible acts of violence in their everyday work, working in that hospital, just extraordinary acts of violence. And I won't go through the detail for those in the House because it's just not the appropriate times, but things that you just would not hear of in many other parts of the country that were happening in these communities. And of course, I want to make the point, Deputy Speaker, that it wasn't just Aboriginal people who were involved in these violent acts at all. That was not the source of the problem. But what it was, Deputy Speaker, was a community that had been frayed and then ripped because of alcohol and because of gambling and because of related activities. And Deputy Speaker, we hear a lot of good talk, positive words in this House about commitment to tackling domestic violence. But Deputy Speaker, if we're serious about this, then the place that we have to begin is in these remote and rural communities. Because, Deputy Speaker, what we know is that Aboriginal women in this country are 34 times more likely to be hospitalised for domestic violence. 34 times, Deputy Speaker. So if we're looking for the epicentre of this crisis, this is where we're going to find it. And what we saw, Deputy Speaker, living in this incredible part of the country was that the violence that was so affecting the life of people living in these communities was joined by a common thread, and that common thread was alcohol. So, Deputy Speaker, I just want to make it really clear how pervasive the effects of this are in these communities, and without having visited them, I think a lot of well-meaning people would really question the need for legislation like this. They would argue the ethical points and they'd be right to raise issues, but without having visited this community, I probably would have shared a lot of those concerns, but having seen it up close, Deputy Speaker, it's really very problematic. So I see this bill very much not as taking control away from those communities, but giving it back, Deputy Speaker, because what we're saying is that the people that live in those communities have the right to live a life without violence and without fear of violence. Deputy Speaker, the theme of control, of course, when we're talking about policies that so affect Aboriginal people, is a very important one, because we know that there is a history here of governments intervening without the willingness and cooperation of Aboriginal people, and in the vast majority of instances when that's occurred, Deputy Speaker, the policies have not worked. But what is absolutely essential for people at home who are interested in this policy area to understand is that this legislation, this notion, this concept is coming to this parliament at the request of the leaders of this community. So, Deputy Speaker, what we have here is a community of people who see a problem, they have identified a solution that they want to trial because of the pervasiveness of this hideous issue, and they've brought it to this parliament. So I say to other political parties who may have a different emphasis on this issue, we have before us a united group of largely Indigenous, though not all Indigenous leaders, who are saying that this is a major problem, they want it to stop, and this is the solution. Now, Deputy Speaker, what message does it send to these communities if the people in this parliament say thanks but no thanks? What we have to do as members of parliament, one of the core things that we can do to improve Indigenous policy in this country is provide people with a voice and then listen to them. And that is very much what I see that we're doing in the bill before us, Deputy Speaker. And we see in various parts of Australia around the country that when we provide these communities with the power to drive policy within their own community, we see really some pretty promising results, Deputy Speaker, in an area where, let's be frank, there isn't a lot of promise to discuss. Deputy Speaker, one of the really important things that I've learned in my life about Indigenous policy is that we cannot group Aboriginal people together in one collective. That's just completely inaccurate, because Aboriginal people all over the country have wildly different life experiences and very different sets of needs and issues and opportunities and gifts to give the rest of the Australian community. And we absolutely see that in the work that I do locally with Indigenous people. It's a completely different policy situation to the one that I experienced where I was up north. So we have to, Deputy Speaker, listen to the leaders of these communities, because they're the ones that are on the ground and they're the ones that understand the specifics of their situation and the solutions to it. We see, for example, in the Cape York community, where not exactly the same type of trial, but Indigenous leaders are the ones who are trying to work with their communities to improve behaviour. And what we see is that in those trials we see significant more success, I think, Deputy Speaker, than we find in many alternative policy approaches. Deputy Speaker, I trust that the people involved in putting this legislation have come to it with really the best intentions, because for all of the very difficult debates that we have across the chamber about most areas of public policy, when it comes to issues like this one, we usually find a lot of common ground across the chamber. We've heard that in the speeches. We've heard some extremely powerful speeches from those on the other side about the concerns that they have, and I respect and acknowledge their willingness to try to tackle these issues. It's an incredibly complex area, a very complex piece of legislation, Deputy Speaker, but one I think that deserves a proper look by a Senate committee. And if the important issues and concerns that have been resolved by people on this side of the House are worked through that process, then I believe this is something that we should trial. And I say that because we are hearing clear clear indications from the Indigenous leaders and the other leaders in these communities that this is what the community wants and needs. Thank you.
I thank the member for Hotham.